Welcome, everyone. Good morning. My name is Guillaume Wiatr. I am the principal and founder of MetaHelm. MetaHelm specializes in strategic storytelling. We help CEOs, executives, entrepreneurs of all sorts build a strategic narrative to unlock new levels of profit and engagement for their business. Today, we are going to cover a topic that is part of the new strategic model that I've been building and developing and writing about in my sometime in the future upcoming book. And this is the prospective story. In this session, I will talk for about 15 to 20 minutes about this focus topic. And then I open it up to you here in the group, in the audience this morning for questions. I will post a replay of this presentation on YouTube, similarly to, just like I did for the other one. The perspective story, like I said, is one of the 4 stories in the strategic narrative model that I suggest that entrepreneurs and leaders use to create a strategic narrative. Previously, we've covered the origin story, the opportunity story, and now we are going to talk about the perspective story today. In this model, one of the things I kind of glazed over are the axes of this model. And as you can see here, I position the perspective story in the upper left corner because the perspective story is really about what you and your team and your community believe. It's something that is kind of internal, as we will see, but it's something that is highly collective. Unlike the origin story, who's very much of a personal topic, internal as well, but more individual. This one is about relationships, is about shared values, is about creating a culture. So this is going to be the focus of our session today. In the origin story, I mentioned that the question that people want you to answer is, how did this start? And I covered examples, from this company in Oregon called Archimoto, who produces electric vehicles. They call them FUV, fun utility vehicles, and how this company started. I covered the example of Blair Ants and Win Without Pitching. I covered the example of Volvo, multiple other companies. And every time what we are seeing is that the company starts with something happening to someone and triggers a sort of emotional reaction that leads to the next question. What is the opportunity there? Where are you taking us with this business? And that's what we saw last week. This week, we're going to move to the next question. How will we get there? What is the path that you believe that we should take to seize this opportunity that makes this business special? And what do we stand for really when we're going to work with you, we're going to follow you as a leader? What should we believe? Maybe we believe the same thing already. And that's a question that the founders of Google so Google was created in 1998, but a few years after, the founders of Google sat down and went on a quest to answer that question, and wrote a document that is available online, still, untouched and still as of today, called 10 Things We Know to Be True. This is, if you go to Google, to the About page of Google, that's where you find it. This is really what Google stands for. These are the 10 principles that Google, in this early version, set to stand for. These are the 10 things that they really believe that are so important that they become their priority. I remember going to, before COVID, going to one of the Google offices, because Google is one of my clients here in Redmond, Washington, and seeing this big sign in the hall, as you come as a visitor, that says that states I think it's number Maybe number, maybe I missed it. Actually, it's number 1. I was looking too far. Focus on the user and all else will follow. And that caught my eye because this is also something that I really believe. Number 1, focus on the user and all else will follow is at the core of my philosophy in terms of strategic narrative. So when I read the sign, I could tell that I agree with that statement. I also believe that. And as I was in this entry hall, I had the feeling of belonging to this community. So that's really what a perspective story should create, is this feeling of belonging. And if if you go to that web page and you search the number of times that the word "we" is used, well, it's used 78 times out of about 1,000 or 1,200 words. So there is really an emphasis on "we." That's the keyword that you need to have in mind when you are about to design your perspective story. Another example I want to share with you, still in the domain of software and technology, is what's called the Agile Manifesto. So if you are building software, if you're a software programmer, I am sure that by now you know this. I ran into this manifesto maybe 10 years ago. It was really, really new to me and my colleagues. And we kind of grappled around this idea. That's also an example of the webpage. Go to agilemanifesto.org. This is what you see here. And this is the perspective that those 8 software developers started to lay out and really write down to explain how software should be built as of today, in the new context of today. The Agile methodology really supports new kinds of interactions between software developers and their users, supports a new kind of timeline to work about a piece of software, suggests that unlike the waterfall approach, which consists of not delivering anything until it's completely finished, the software that you're working on should be delivered in this prototype mode. So I'm probably not coding this exactly right, but this just to give you an idea here. And this created a huge movement in the software industry. This is a group of, this was just put independently. There was not a private company as the author of this manifesto. This was just, a group of people really standing for something different in the software industry. And this created a huge movement. Cohorts, dozens, thousands of companies live by those principles today. So this is just to show you the power of what a new perspective in an industry or a given domain can create. So as you see this, you're here in this audience starting to see how this type of story might apply to you. What could this become for your specific industry? This morning, I was working with the head of a consulting firm based in France, and we're working on developing their own perspective. They specialize in sales coaching, business development coaching. And I've been working with them to help them craft and crystallize what are the tenets, what are the values that they should prioritize in their work. One of the ways to represent what a perspective story could look like is this diagram, right? So let's do a quick test here. As you're looking at this diagram, what are you noticing? What are you noticing first? So you may unmute your your microphone here and tell me what's the first thing that stands out here?
The short one.
That's right. That's the answer I was fishing for. The short one. And that's just the core of, that's just perfect to illustrate how the human brain works. We just notice what's different, what stands out. The irony here is that in this diagram, that's actually not what stands out, because that's the shorter one. Stand out would mean that it's actually, it sticks out. It doesn't stick out, but it stands out because it's shorter than the rest. And so that has very important implications. Why does a perspective story matter? So I'm going to spend a few minutes on that slide. Just bear with me, but I was able to list at least 7 functions, but there are well over 10 of them. As of today, I just haven't had the time to write carefully about them, but here are at least 7 things that should explain why this matters so much. The first one is identity. Your perspective story is your opinion, and an opinion about how you're going to deliver on the opportunity story. Opinions shape who we are, as a person and as a group. In saying what we stand, we express why we exist, which is really our purpose. Number 2 is priorities. A perspective story is a set of values, as you saw in the Google example or the Agile Manifesto. Those 10 principles represent what those groups value most of all. So they help you answer the question, what matters to me and to us here in my team and to our clients and the people we help? When your business grows and you have to make choices, your perspective provides guidance to stay focused on the priorities that matter most to you. The next one is evolution, because a perspective is a reason to disagree. I borrow this quote. I borrow this quote from Blair Ants, the founder of Win Without Pitching, and I really like it because what it says is that a perspective is probably a departure from an old way of doing something that maybe your competitors really are attached to, stick to, and defend. So there is really this idea of innovation, evolution, departure, new thinking, risk-taking also, because thinking differently is kind of scary, to be honest. No evolution is possible if you don't contradict what normal people think. It helps you go against the grain. That's really what the perspective story is about. Now it's up to you to decide how much of that against the grain thinking you're ready to go with, to do. The fourth one is differentiation. Differentiation, especially today in our markets where it's really busy. Think about the graphic designers. How many graphic design agencies do we have out there? Real estate. How many real estate companies and brokers do we have out there? How are you going to help your clients choose you versus somebody else? Well, in going against the grain, you will differentiate. You are going to make it easier for your clients to choose you or not, because you will set clear expectations. If you work with me, this is how we do it. Interested? Do you think you value this too? Well, let's work together. But the promise is that we're not going to work this other way. Prospect would either agree or disagree with you, and your perspective story will therefore create a filter that will set you apart from your competition. And of course, this becomes a very strong cultural element. So number 5 is culture. Organizations with a perspective, a thesis, a point of view, an ideology, nurture a strong culture. They build a strong set of values. They feel very strongly about how things should work. They are opinionated and they grow well because their perspective nurtures people who believe what they believe. Another strong element of a perspective story. They cultivate a specific way of thinking, talking, and acting. Hence the word culture. At a strategic level, this also gives you the chance to be much clearer on your direction. And that's probably why the number 1 reason I call this a strategic narrative, because it helps you decide what's going to happen next for your organization and your business. Your perspective helps you decide which direction to go next. It's an essential asset for leadership and strategy. It shows through the choices and decisions that you make. Really, your value exists here to your set of values, exist here to help you make better decisions. A perspective is a way to make strategic choices, such as what supplier should we work with? What kind of client do we agree to work with? Do we target? Are we interested in collaborating? Who should be our partners? I mean, the list is really, really long. A company that really lives by their value that comes to mind is Patagonia. And what they do great is that they publish a lot about their decisions, how to source their material, how to sell their equipment, their products. And they do a really great job at connecting these decisions with their perspective. Finally, a perspective story will help you create interest, because what is different and sticks out is interesting. Think about it. You walk outside, you look around, and you'll probably notice that you spend more time noticing what is unusual. That's human nature. So start by figuring out what everybody else thinks in your environment, in your community, in your market, and challenge those assumptions. What is the common wisdom? Ask yourself, is this common wisdom right? Should we all work like this? Is this okay? Or is it maybe time to move on and think about new ways of doing something? You probably know the company called Impossible Foods. They produce burgers out of vegetables. And they're challenging our assumptions. They are challenging the old narrative that a meal should have animal meat in it. For a lot of people, that's what a meal is. A meal without meat is not a meal. And they suggest that we should probably think about this differently, because it has very negative and big impacts on our planet. But to these days, the switch from one narrative to the other has been, quite difficult, because a burger is actually really, really good, right? I love burgers. Am I ready to give up, to give away eating a good beef burger? Probably, but I would say that I would, mostly miss it. But the perspective that Impossible Food defends helps them stand out, be more creative, be more innovative, and it looks like they're succeeding in their mission and creating this new opportunity ahead of us. Another example that I have discussed in a previous strategic underground narrative session is the example of Volvo. And in a nutshell, in the 60s, when Volvo launched the 3-point seatbelt, safety became really the one word that you can think about, and until today, about their perspective. All cars should be as safe as possible to drive, and we're fanatic about safety. That's still their communication platform. That's still their branding. This is an old advertisement for Volvo at the time. The car for people who think. All right. I always leave you in the session with the practical tool that you can start using today. I call those tools basic story archetype. And here is the tool that you could use for this one. People think that, insert common wisdom here. In general, people think that something that's the way it is, that's the status quo. But we disagree. We believe that, insert here how you think that the work should happen. Again, you might think that I'm trying to steer you to become a revolutionary, and that might be very French of me, but that's not necessarily my intent. My intent is to challenge your assumptions, help you think differently for sure, but you should always do this in all honesty, with authenticity, with integrity, and only challenge what needs to be challenged, not just for the purpose of just being different or a revolutionary. But that's about it for the perspective story. And we have a few more minutes where I'd like to get your perspective. Actually, that's a very meta question. What is your perspective on the perspective story? And what do you think that your perspective is today in your own business?
So I was actually on a meeting with a mayor in one of the towns recently, and in talking about why I joined real estate, he mentioned that I was different. And I think it was because of that perspective piece. And I think I need to flesh it out further. But I was speaking to him about how I feel it's a service versus being about sales. And how it's a service to the community and to an individual, both from like a financial planning standpoint and education standpoint, also how it impacts their personal lives. And I think that mindset piece can be a differentiator for me.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's an unusual mindset as well. And Anna, if I may ask, when you think about service, in your mind, what is the service? What is the value of the service that you deliver to the community? Do you have examples of what this might look like?
Well, for instance, I'm helping somebody who is in his early 30s. His family is immigrants from Trinidad. None of them have ever owned property in the United States before. And so the thought of being a homeowner is a little was originally a little out of reach in his mind because he didn't necessarily have any family role models to show them that it was attainable. So I really focused on explaining the process, also sharing that I'd be there with him through the whole process, and also keeping it as simple and fun as possible. So to take some of that stress away.
Yes.
And I think, you know, if for him to be able to buy property, that's going to change his quality of life.
Yeah, the impact could be huge. I mean, where you live is has a huge impact. And I agree with you. The process of acquiring a home is, you know, in some cases extremely stressful.
Yes,
it's not just about the transaction. It's about all the experience and the service that you can provide.
The emotion too that goes along with it.
Yeah, the emotion too. Absolutely. Now you see, there is a connection with the opportunity story that we discussed last week. You know, the opportunity here is to own a piece of property, access, you know, a new lifestyle, you know, live with his family differently. I mean, you name it. You name it. I think that's an awesome example.
Cool.
Yeah, I think you should really keep digging here and explore how you might bring this idea into as an integral mode of functional mode, modus operandi, how you roll, you know, because that becomes part of your daily activities, that becomes part of your brand, that becomes part of your choices. Who do you want to work with? Make sure that you work with people who understand that this is the value they're getting when they work with you. And maybe if they're just looking for the transaction, they should work with somebody else. So there's value for you in this too. Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah. Awesome example. Awesome example. Great. Well, anybody wants to share another example or other thoughts? It doesn't have to be their own, but it could be another company that you've noticed. Yeah, Josh. Hello.
Hi. So I have a graphic design studio, and coming up through school and previous jobs in the first 15 years of my business, the role of designer and customer was kind of like this. Like the customer came and said, please make this thing for me, and then the magical designer made a magical thing and said, here are the things, you can choose one of these magical objects and it will save your change your future. And it's not really fun that way, and it really is adversarial, and it doesn't really build trust because know if you have any magic powers. They might doubt that you're a real magician, and you're not really respecting that they have opinions and they know their customer. So we like to bring them down and kind of mash them together. And I think that's new for a lot of people. I know there are other agencies and studios who work that way, but there are a lot of people that have worked with designers who just disappear into a black box, do their thing, and say, "Here you go." And it's just it's not the right way to do it. So we've changed how we do things so that we show the mess, we show the process, we show that it's not magic, it's just a lot of work, and here's the work. And then they trust us, we can trust them, everybody can say what they need to say, and laugh at the terrible ideas that we didn't think were good, and they got to see how bad they were. So they trust us that we know what's a bad idea, and it's a lot more fun for everybody too. So that's not really a tight package, but that's something we're doing.
So with the perspective, could this perspective here summarized into collaboration?
Yeah.
Co-creation. There's something there that creates an element of newness, of, it's a differentiating element, as we said earlier. Culturally, that's the way you work also. So you're going to have different behaviors than another agency. This is a great path to go on, because also you just said, they trust us when together we found an idea that is not so good, but they also trust you in the opposite case when you came up with a genius idea. They trust us when you advise them to choose one option versus the other, for instance. So there's more leeway for you to wow them and create value and do the work that you're supposed to do.
That sounds like a partnership.
Yes, partnership.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. Something that occurred to me, Guillaume, when you were talking about the Agile Manifesto and the idea of delivering prototypes rather than a finished product. You're doing the same thing with your work. You're following the Agile Manifesto by throwing prototypes at us all throughout the writing of your book, which which is great. Yeah.
I'm so glad you noticed that, because that's really much how I roll.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's a good role.
Good. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for that feedback. And I'm still working on overcoming the fear of not delivering something good enough, because that's very much how I was raised, raised with the expectation that everything I do should be really great. And I think it's great. I think it's good, but up to a certain extent. And still, sometimes in the work that I do, I notice that I put a lot of time, and it can create a certain level of stress. So it's probably why I picked those examples here, Google and the Agile Manifesto, because I think they also speak this. They obviously speak to me. I think they've had a really strong and positive, influence on our society, in creating more meaningful environment and more meaningful work for people, in organizations.
Mm-hmm. Well, also, Josh, you're talking about being partners with your clients and taking them on the journey all along the way, like looking at the bad ideas along with the good ones or the better ones. That too is an agile approach. It's like they get to see how the sausage is made, right?
Yeah.
And that I think that's a challenge for artists to, everything that we're doing is artistic in some manner. It's creative in some manner. So you're putting something out there that's a reflection of you. And there's always a concern about, oh, I need this to be, acceptable or decent or better, or like we get hung up into perfecting something and never getting it out there. And it's better to I don't know what the saying is, something like perfection is the enemy of progress or something like that. I don't know. There's something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's another say too, practice doesn't make perfect, but practice makes progress.
Yeah.
Something it's related to this.
Yeah.
Related to this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. See, that's a great example of what a philosophy does. It evolves society. It evolves us, humanity. That's what at least a positive philosophy does. I always like to think about the perspective with a grain of salt. The very nature of a perspective, the very assumption is that the perspective is never perfect, is never for everyone else. It's meant to have almost a polarizing effect sometimes. So always keep that in mind, is that the principles of Agile work really great in some environments, but kind of defeats the purpose in other places. What else I'm trying to think about an example. Well, with the vaccine, right? It's kind of the opposite. There's a very strict process, there are regulations, so that we know how to control the prototypes, and so that the prototypes are as safe as possible, and that when we're ready to roll out, the chances, the efficacy and the risk are as low as possible too. So you always have to think about, okay, what are the implications of my perspective? That's really, it ties to an ethical also aspect of a perspective. Providing collaboration, providing partnership, providing a service sound all great. Where is the limit to this? I think is a fair assumption.
Well, when lives are at risk, or
Yes,
safety is involved, I mean,
right.
you don't want, look at what happened with Boeing and, the recent plane snafus. It's like, were they following an agile philosophy when they did that? Because it appears like possibly they were. So, it's like because of the accidents, so there are things, I understand what you're saying. It doesn't apply to all areas, but
Not everybody's ready or not. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say the stakes are different for different projects. Volvo's seatbelts, their prototypes had to be actually capable of saving a life before they put them out into the market.
Yes. Yeah.
They had to be good.
Yeah. In the case of that's an interesting segue. In the case of Volvo, also in that story, the engineer who came up with the seatbelt had a lot of experience in aircraft ejection systems. So he had built his own perspective in designing those devices. It's not, an aircraft is different than a car, but I think it's fair to assume that when you worked in a field for so long, you've had time to run into experiences, tests and failures and successes that help you shape your overall perspective on how something should be done. And so that's why I like to think about it as a cultural element, because the perspective is not shaped just by one person, but by a group of people. It's socially constructed. And that's why I always say a narrative is socially constructed, right? It's always about who works together to develop, that perspective, and how we find consensus in the set of principles that we stand to defend. And that's why it's in the upper left quadrant of my model. It's collective, yet kind of internal at first, and then it's shared. Well, thank you so much for joining today. This was another very interesting session. Really appreciate the time you're dedicating to showing up to those strategic narrative underground sessions. I'll see you next week for another chapter.